Hujambo Espresso Talk Today community. Akwaba to the Espresso Talk Today show. Welcome to Espresso Talk Today. I'm Amma Robin, host of this great and groundbreaking podcast show. If you're just joining Espresso Talk Today, then I wish you an especially happy and hearty Akwaba to the show and to the Espresso Talk Today community. Our community of amiable intellectuals welcomes everyone. We discuss concepts and ideas, we listen to concepts and ideas, and we share concepts and ideas. Nothing is off the table here. And this is how we grow and thrive as a community. So asante sana to all for joining us today. Speaking of today, today's show completes our Black History series that we have joyfully and courageously done in honor of Black History Month. As Espresso Talk Today listeners know, I love history. So Black History Month is an exciting time, an especially exciting time for me. But I'm learning and enjoying history all year long. I hope you are too. But I didn't always feel this way about history. I thought that it was boring and irrelevant. I understand now that there are two reasons for this feeling. The first was the way that history was taught. We were forced to learn names, dates, and death counts. History was something that started and ended way back then. It had no relevance for today. That was a really bad approach to teaching history, just gotta say it. And it almost stopped me from learning, understanding, and appreciating it. My second reason for my disinterest in history takes us directly into today's show. So bear with me for a moment. When I was a kid, when I was young, I was told that Africa has no history. I was taught that in school. I was taught that on television. Everywhere I turned, I was taught that Africa has no history. I do have to say, though, that my parents taught me differently. My father in particular taught me a lot about African history. Okay, I didn't always believe everything he said, but it turns out he was telling me the truth. The problem was that other trusted sources, like teachers, professors, television, books, were saying something different. Some sources basically told me that Africa has no history. At least, Africa has no history before the arrival of the Europeans. Others wrote Africans out of history. And still others showed African history dominated and led, and the culture led by white people. Remember the Tarzan shows? I may be dating myself, but yeah, I remember Tarzan. Remember Elizabeth Taylor, a white woman playing Cleopatra. And I actually like Elizabeth Taylor, but a white woman playing Cleopatra, And remember Albert Schweitzer and Cecil B. Rhodes in Southern Africa, who were, quote unquote, civilizing the Africans, bringing culture, language, and art to Africa. If you've read any of the books by Joseph Conrad, like in particular Heart of Darkness, you will see how Africa was regarded. It wasn't regarded, and how Africans were written out of history. I also remember how my teachers taught me that history only begins with written language. Well, this is, credited correctly to the ancient Phoenicians who founded the first alphabetic writing system. The Phoenicians were based in today's Eastern Mediterranean, the modern day Syria and Lebanon. No disrespect to the Phoenicians, none. That was an important invention in communication. Writing is certainly one way to express language and culture, but it isn't the only way. there is also the spoken word. I won't go into other forms of communication because that'll take us too far off track, but there's the spoken word. But some people decided that history will begin only with having a written alphabet. Now, where did that leave many Africans who relied on oral expression or a non-alphabetic written expression? Well, that cut us out. People said that that's only prehistory. That's not history. Really, yeah, really. So this discreetly wrote Africans and Africa out of history. By the way, I see this is still happening. I see many books about the world's greatest explorers or the world's greatest artists, the world's greatest literature and the greatest music and other so-called greatest. And when I look in those books, Africa and Africans are very rarely included. Most of the time they're completely not, but there may be one thing out of 100 in the book. And just to also say that when I see those kind of books, if Africans aren't in it, I put them back. Those books are simply retelling a white supremacist history, a white supremacist account of all the greatest in the world. And then distorting history and telling lies about history are ways of writing Black people out of history. Omitting Black people from history is another way of distorting history and a way, you gotta hear this, of promoting white supremacy. As children, we picked up on these cues. And as I said a few weeks ago, this inferiorized Black children and made many of us want to distance ourselves from anything or anyone who was Black. And it also superiorized white children, as I said a few weeks ago. I've learned differently now about African history. I've visited Africa. I've read excellent books about Africa. I've talked to African scholars. I've studied and learned so many amazing things about Africa. And it's incredible history. Yes, it's incredible history. But I am still recovering from the damage, the inferiorization that was caused by my miseducation in learning that Africa has no history. Many Black people are recovering. We're in different stages, and that's okay because we're all in this together. So Espresso Talk Today is closing out Black History Month and the series by presenting a little bit of African history. That's right. It's not even close to complete. That would take a very, very, very long time. But it's a step in acknowledging that Africa does indeed have history and culture and art and philosophy and language and economics and literature and science. And okay, I'll stop there. I think you get the point. This is also an acknowledgement that African American history did not begin in America. It began in Africa and it continued in America. Generation after generation, the seed was planted in Africa. We hope that you enjoy this little taste of African history that we'll share with you today. It is just a taste to hopefully pique your interest in wanting to know more. We do have a bigger presentation of African history that we call our Sankofa stories, four parts. But today we're just going to do the first part. This taste of Africa is presented by Kirk Wadi of the Wadi Speaks YouTube channel, who presents Black history every single week. By the way, Kirk has made a YouTube video about this amazing story today, so you may want to go watch that too. It really is great. Well, let's get started. So sit back and relax, grab an espresso or a cup of tea if that's your preference. I won't return after Kirk's presentation. I'll just hope that you see that Africa absolutely has a history and how that history is being hidden, forgotten, and simply denied. I won't stand for it anymore. Let's all stay curious and never stop learning. Asante Sana for joining us today. Let's get it going.
Hello, my name is Kirk Wadi from Wadi Speaks, and today I have the privilege to delve into a bit of history with you in a story called Sankofa, an African-American saga. This is part 1, The Kingdoms of Africa and the Slave Trade. Long ago, there were many different empires and kingdoms in Africa. These empires were flourishing. The great diversity of cultures in Africa, the vast geographical size and diverse terrain of the world's second largest continent supported the growth of these great empires. There were thousands of different ethnic groups in Africa, and each with its own language, traditions, and customs. Notably, there were 3 great empires in West Africa: the Empire of the Soninke people, of ancient Ghana and Ouagadougou, as it was called, followed by the Empire of Mali, then the Empire of Songhay. The medieval empires dominated West Africa for more than 900 years. The people of these kingdoms specialized in beautiful, luxurious items made of bronze, ivory, gold, and terracotta, known and desired by people all around the world. Superior iron technology, weaponry, efficient food production, as well as regional and trans-Saharan trade in salt, copper, dates, wheat, sorghum, figs, henna, and other commodities that contributed to the thriving and prosperous economies in these empires. Ancient Ghana, or Ouagadougou, was described as a land of mystery and fabled wealth. It was said that gold grows in the sand as carrots do and is plucked at sunrise. Others simply said that all the earth is gold. Visitors to Ouagadougou also described the large, prosperous towns with well-built and handsome houses. The most popular currency was the cowrie shell, and it remained the currency of choice for hundreds of years. Later, the cowrie was used for jewelry, clothing, drums, and headdresses. However, Ouagadougou declined due to climate change and the expansion of the Sahara Desert. But the ancient empire of Mali grew in prosperity. Ivory, salt, and prisoners of war or captured slaves. These were its most important commodities. Ancient Mali was known for its famous city of Timbuktu, which had been mythologized for centuries. Timbuktu was a very real and prominent market city along the trans-Saharan trade route. The city of Timbuktu was known at the height of the ancient empire of Mali as a great center of learning and scholarship. The Songhai Empire had a different history. Its residents established settlements along the banks of the Niger River and specialized in trade, commerce, food gathering and production, boat and canoe building, and farming in the fertile lands that bordered the river. It was a complex and prosperous empire that consisted of many different groups, due to occupation, particularly of the Gao and the Dole. Other great kingdoms and empires existed in Africa. The Kingdom of Benin contained one of the single greatest feats of architecture and engineering that the world had ever seen in the 16th century. The Benin City walls, they were 4 times longer than the Great Wall of China and consumed 100 times more material than the Great Pyramid of Cheops. It was described as the largest single archaeological phenomenon on the planet. In 1691, Benin City, which was protected by the Benin City walls, had a population of 16,000 people. The houses were large, the city was wealthy and industrious. It was so well governed that theft was unknown and the people lived in such security that they had no doors on their houses. Benin City is also said to have been one of the first cities to have street lamps, which were tall metal lamps, several feet high that were fueled by palm oil and designed to provide light mostly in and around palace grounds. However, the Benin city walls were destroyed by the British in 1897. There was the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, which was home to around 18,000 people at its peak and spanned across an area of 3 square miles. This civilization had a monopoly on the trade of gold and ivory from the southeastern coast of the continent to the interior, and were famed miners specializing in minerals such as iron, copper, and gold. The Mutapa Empire stretched from Zambezi and the Limpopo rivers to the Indian Ocean in southern Africa. It was rich in gold and silver, copper, and salt. The Kingdom of Mutapa wielded such power, they acquired a subsidy from every Portuguese captain who took office in Mozambique, and they imposed a 50% tax levy on all trade goods imported. The Kingdom of Congo, at its height, the empire stretched into what would become both the Congo and Angola. This expansion was due to the leadership of the Kikongo warrior Lukin Lua Nimi. Congo's military and political prowess dominated Central Africa for centuries. At the time, Congolese society was quasi-feudal, and its economy was fueled by trade routes following rivers in the region and dealing in textiles, pottery, copper, and ivory. The riches of these kingdoms and empires also allowed the people to be highly educated in the sciences and skilled in mathematics, medicine, and astronomy. By trading their many goods, these empires were able to amass large amounts of wealth, treasures, and goods. It was an era of growth and prosperity in the kingdoms. African empires were prosperous with their highly developed structures of political systems, complex cultures, languages, spiritual and ancestral customs, and oral history traditions. Then the Europeans started arriving in large numbers. Africa would change forever. One day, the West African kingdoms were visited by European traders. The African kingdoms had traded with the Europeans through their North African trade partners, but now the Europeans started to sail south to the African kingdoms to trade directly. The Europeans were hoping that by coming to Africa, they could get all of the best goods that the kingdoms had to offer. And the Europeans were pleased with what they saw. The kingdoms were rich with bronze, terracotta, and ivory decorations, all carefully crafted and beautiful to look at. The traders saw that the African kingdoms were bountiful with high quality and exotic spices, one of the most notable being pepper. And most of all, the kingdoms had gold. Lots and lots of gold that the Europeans wanted. Seeing all of these treasures made the Europeans happy, but they noticed something else. The Africans had slavery. Now let's get something clear. The slavery that was practiced in Africa was much different than the slavery we know today. In the West African kingdoms, slaves were still granted many basic rights. Slaves could marry whoever they wanted, buy and own property, and even own slaves themselves. Slavery was also seen as a way to develop wealthy connections. By working for a wealthy master, you could be seen in good favor and increase your status in society when you were freed. It's important to note that slaves in the West African kingdoms were released after a certain number of years. Slavery was also never passed down from one generation to another. And most importantly, this form of slavery was not racially motivated. There was never a concept that one race of people should be in servitude to another. Along with the goods they bought, the Europeans also brought home several slaves. Europe was going through a period of growth, and the Europeans thought that by having slaves, they could make more goods without having to pay the labor to make them. The Europeans didn't understand the slavery system in Africa or how it worked. All they saw was a way for them to get people to work for them for free. The next time the Europeans came to Africa, they raided towns and villages to imprison the people there and bring the people back as slaves. The African kingdoms had traded slaves before, and some kingdoms saw the Europeans' desire for slaves as profitable as selling other goods. These kingdoms said that they could gather slaves together and sell them to the Europeans. This agreement made the Europeans very happy and very rich. And just as promised, the West African kingdoms had slaves ready to sell to the Europeans when they arrived. The promise of free labor and other goods attracted many Europeans who came to do more trade with the kingdoms that were selling slaves. But this wasn't enough. European traders wanted more slaves to buy, and they had an idea of how to do it. Many of the slaves that the Europeans bought were prisoners of war. So the Europeans offered military alliances to the African kingdoms who sold the slaves to them. Then the Europeans encouraged the kingdoms to fight with the other African kingdoms. This fighting would lead to more prisoners of war and consequently more slaves for them to buy. As the Americas began to grow and developed, the European traders saw an opportunity to sell some of the slaves to get American goods as well. This began the notorious transatlantic slave trade, where European traders would go to Africa to get goods, including slaves, and then sail to the Americas to sell slaves and their other goods. Then they would return to Europe with their riches. This trading system is what brought many of the first slaves to the United States. This is what started the long and difficult history of slavery, discrimination, and civil rights disputes that would shape much of what the United States is today. The European scramble for Africa would start following the abolition of slavery. Although the slave trade was over, colonialism would enslave, disempower, and impoverish Africa for decades. Thank you for listening. I'm Kirk Wadi.